All right, well, we do like to start and end on time here at the Bar Association, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our monthly installment of Hot Talks. These are designed to be conversations that are ripped from the headlines about topics that are happening in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio, and Cleveland. Today, we are talking about redistricting, which has had a little bit of movement this week. So we're right on time to be discussing this. We are going to have presentations from our panelists in the beginning, but we do want your questions and comments. So please use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen to put your questions and comments, and I will be throwing those to our moderator and panel. We do want to hear from you. We do want to hear your questions. So please make sure you put those in there. And with that, I'm going to send it to Jay Milano. He is the chair of our Thought Leadership Committee this year, which really helps us put on these hot talks. So Jay, thank you for moderating today, and take it away.
Well, that's easy. Thank you. My job in this is simple. I will introduce our guests and get out of their way, except, there's always an except. I think you guys should know that this is the first of what we're beginning as a series of presentations on the rule of law. The rule of law as a shield, the rule of law as a bludgeon. So over the next 6 months, you will be seeing presentations on policing as the rule of law, on women's rights as the rule of law, on voter suppression as the rule of law. We'll be going through these on a monthly basis, so just watch for them. They should start next month with policing, but we'll see. But as for now, this is the most timely of topics. The Supreme Court heard arguments this week on the constitutional amendment gerrymandering. And we have 2 people with us today, both of whom are brilliant, committed to this field, experienced in it, and willing to talk to us and explain to us what has happened, what is happening, and what may happen. So it's both Katy Shanahan and Brian Glassman. Brian is our first speaker. He is a professor emeritus at Cleveland State. He now teaches election law and has 27 years, I think, at Cleveland State. He has presented at Cleveland State to the Bar Association, to the commission. He's been an expert witness on this. And I have to tell you, because I found it most interesting, he also taught art law this year. Professor Glassman is an artist. And if you look above his head, you will see his 20-year-old or 30-year-old art version, 40 years old, art version, his version of Andy Warhol's soup can. So it's an extraordinary diversity of experience and of interest. So Professor Glassman, I've spoken too long already. Go ahead, sir. Oh, wait, 1 more minute though. I think I should do this. I think that you should hear, I had asked the professor and I asked Katy if there was one thing that I can say about them, or I should say, as I introduce them, and he sent this back and I just got it. So let me read this to you, because this is what he'd say is his belief. It is his belief that elections, of which redistricting is a part, should be nonpartisan, non-issue. It is our representative democracy. When more voters participate, we all win. When fewer voters participate, we all lose. So with your words, sir, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jay, for the introduction. My thanks to CMBA for inviting me to speak. And Katy, it's a real pleasure to get to present with you today. Suffice it to say, this is an important topic. The stakes are extraordinarily high, including control of the United States House of Representatives. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Please give me a thumbs down if you cannot see my images. Katy, can you see? Give me a thumbs up. Great. Okay, so here's my roadmap. Going to cover the first 3 bullet points on this roadmap, figuring that we will in the course of our Q&A, probably get to the latter 3 bullet points that you see up there. So just a quick refresher about reapportionment and redistricting. As you see from this definition that I've created, it's a process. It takes into account population shifts, both within states and nationally, for purposes of drawing voting districts, because voting districts need to be of equal population. So this is about seats in state legislatures and seats in the United States House of Representatives from each state. As to the latter, states can gain or lose seats depending on those population shifts. Ohio has had 16 seats in its congressional delegation, but we're losing a seat because our population did not grow as fast as the populations in other states. So we're going to be down to 15, which is part of the redistricting process. Of course, this is all based on results of the decennial census conducted by the US Census Bureau. What's gerrymandering? It's a method of maximizing political advantage to gain as many seats in the legislative body as possible. 2 primary ways to do that: packing one's opponent's voters into as few voting districts as possible, or cracking them, spreading them across as many voting districts as possible. In either case, their votes, the power of their votes diluted through these strategies. A couple of gerrymandering basics. Yes, that is Elbridge Gerry on the left. Actually a very important figure in the founding of our nation. Yes, that's a salamander in the middle. And yes, that is the infamous Essex County gerrymander. Of course, you get that word by combining Jerry's name with salamander, the infamous 1812 Essex County, Massachusetts gerrymander. So 3 things to keep in mind whenever we're talking about gerrymandering. First, who draws the maps? Second, what criteria are used in drawing them, and what tools are used to do so? And third, what judicial oversight is there of the results? So in our representative democracy, where we do not vote individually on every matter of concern, instead we choose our leaders to represent us and through the electoral process. There are many who believe that when gerrymandering becomes so extreme, the opposite is occurring. Leaders are choosing their voters because those leaders control the map drawing process. It all begins with the Elections Clause in the United States Constitution, which you see here. It places authority and responsibility for conducting elections, both state and federal, with the states. Again, places responsibility initially. That means that Congress may, as you see in the last 2 lines, jump in and issue rules about the conduct of election. Think Voting Rights Act of 1965, or the Motor Voter Law of the early 1990s, or the Help America Vote Act of the early 2000s. This is critically important because of what I'm now showing you, something called Red Map. Republicans came to understand before the 2010 election cycle really where the power lays, where the power is. It is in the state legislatures because of the, again, control and authority of those bodies to administer elections. Republicans also realized how relatively inexpensive it was to fund campaigns for seats in the state legislature and made a huge push in 2010. It was quite successful. I'm just going to show you some numbers from Ohio. Focus, if you would, on the upper left-hand corner of my screen. You'll see that in 2008, Democrats enjoyed a 53-46 margin in the 99-seat Ohio House. That completely flipped with the 2010 election, Republicans gaining 59 of the 99 seats. A little different story on the Ohio Senate side. Republicans were already in control, but in both the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate, you see how Republicans have slowly and steadily built on their margins up through 2020. With respect to Ohio's US congressional delegation, Ohio voters across the state voted about a 54-46% rate, Republican, Democratic. Nonetheless, Republicans have held 12 of the 16 congressional seats in all 5 of the election cycles over the last 10 years. That brings me to the 2 ballot initiatives. The 2015 ballot initiative for seats in the state assembly, I'm sorry, in the General Assembly in Ohio, and the 2018 ballot initiative for Congress. Understand that in addition to choosing to put elected officials into office or removing them from office, Ohio voters have another way of expressing themselves, and that is through the ballot initiative process. Article 2 of the Ohio Constitution details about that process also spelled out in this section of the Ohio Revised Code, which you see on the screen. These 2 initiatives passed by 70 and 75% respectively, which obviously means that many Republicans also wanted a change from the then existing procedure that gave the power to the state legislature to redistrict. I will say that both the ballot initiatives spoke to bipartisanship, spoke to transparency. As to the first, the process was expected to be bipartisan, and straight party line votes were only supposed to happen as a last resort. It was a multi-step procedure, and you don't get to straight party line votes until the very end if everything else fails. As to transparency, there were supposed to be public hearings. There were supposed to be multiple public hearings with significant opportunity for the public to participate and offer comments on proposed maps. Oh yes, I wanted to specifically mention this because this is really at the heart of the litigation that's before the Ohio Supreme Court at the present time. Both Articles 11 and 19, which are the result of the 2 ballot initiatives. Article 11 contains multiple references to partisan fairness and proportionality. Article 19 contains multiple references to partisan fairness. Not unreasonable to voters to believe they were going to see more partisan fairness as a result of the passage of these 2 ballot initiatives. I wanted to mention in the previous slide, understands that with the creation of the Ohio Redistricting Commission, that did take some degree of power away from the state legislature to draw the maps on its own without input from anybody else. But not all redistricting commissions are created equal. Some are more independent than others, and Ohio's is not completely independent of political actors. So that gets us up to Governor DeWine's 2018 campaign for governor. And he said this, that the voters said that the redistricting process should be done in a bipartisan way. And when I'm governor, there will be an expectation that the new district maps honor the voters' wishes. So that gets us up to the 2021 redistricting process, which began in late summer and has continued through the fall, and as we know is in litigation before the Ohio Supreme Court with respect to both the state maps and the congressional maps. So how did things go? Katy Shanahan is going to give a much fuller description of how they went. I'm just going to hit a few highlights here and turn things over to her. Bipartisanship, well, all of the final votes were along straight party lines. One consequence of that, as designed and set forth in the two constitutional amendments 11 and 19, is that these maps are in effect for only 4 years. As to transparency, there were concerns about hearings beginning late in the time frame that the provisions had established, about the number of hearings, about notice that was given. I can tell you that when I testified on October 23rd, there were no maps for me to comment upon. And so I was only able to offer general testimony about the benefits of participation by all sides, that is to say, among Ohio's voters. And with respect to products, just one highlight here. Again, Katie's going to get into this more, I think, but the Congressional Map, which had been 12-4, as you remember from an earlier slide, for 10 years. 12 Republican, 4 Democratic members in the Ohio delegation to Congress, is now expected to produce a 13-2 Republican majority. Again, notwithstanding our 54-46 the way that we vote across Ohio, roughly 54-46 Republican to Democratic. So there is no such thing as a perfect map. Ask any map expert, because it's just impossible to score high on all of the many criteria that are typically considered in drawing voting districts. What I can tell you is that there has been evaluation of the new maps by outside experts. One of those is the nonpartisan Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And that organization gave the following overall grades to the 3 Ohio maps, which you see. And those scores, those grades, excuse me, are also reflected in the partisan fairness assessments the Princeton Gerrymandering did, which is one of the criteria that goes into the overall grade. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Katy Shanahan.
Thank you, Professor. I appreciate that. It's so nice to be with all of you, even if just virtually. My name is Katy Shanahan. I'm the Ohio State Director for All on the Line, which is a grassroots advocacy campaign that's part of a national effort to restore fairness to our redistricting process and to end gerrymandering. And it's been my job for the last little more than 2.5 years to engage and train everyday Ohioans across this state to participate in our redistricting process and to demand that not only our process, but also our ultimate maps actually live up to the promise and spirit of our reform measures that we passed in 2015 and in 2018, and that we get an outcome that's actually reflective of how we vote and protective of our ability to elect representatives who actually represent us. So I also am going to share my slides. Just have a few to go over. So Brian was so helpful to sort of set up the scene for how we got here, and my presentation will cover what actually happened in the map drawing process, what our ultimate maps actually look like, unfortunately what gerrymandering still looks like in Ohio, and then talk a little bit at the end about what comes next in our fight for fair maps. I say that the map drawing process itself was merely phase 1 of our redistricting process. Of course, now we're in phase 2 of the process, which is litigating over those maps. And my organization is a part of that legal fight. So very glad to be continuing these efforts to get a more representative state legislative set of maps and also congressional ones. So first we'll start with the state legislative process because that happened first. Not only included in our reform measures were rules about who drew the map, so that set up a brand new 7-member commission who was in charge of drawing our state legislative districts. So that commission was the new apportionment board, which is what existed 10 years ago. And that commission had 5 Republicans, 2 Democrats. So you're already dealing with an incredibly lopsided body who is drawing the maps themselves. And then, as Brian pointed out, not all commissions are created equal. We do not have an independent commission structure here in Ohio. Our commission was filled entirely with elected officials, politicians. So rounding out that 7 members was the governor, secretary of state, the auditor, and then 4 legislative members, the speaker of the House and the Senate House Minority Leader, and Senator Sykes, who was appointed by the Senate Minority Leader, Kenny Yuko. So that's who the 7 members were. And that setup was instructed in our 2015 reform, but also included in those rules were a guide for how the process should look and ultimately what the maps should look like. So how did we actually fare in living up to those promises for how the process would look? Well, we didn't do too well. We started late and we also ended late. We actually missed both of our constitutional deadlines to adopt maps. So as part of our reforms, we provided September 1st as the initial deadline by when a bipartisan 10-year set of state legislative maps needed to be due. We didn't actually even get maps proposed before that date from the Republican caucus. The Senate Democratic caucus did actually introduce a proposed map at the end of August, so just barely meeting that September 1st deadline, at least on their end. But the commission itself did not actually even propose a map until we were well into September. Then there was a fallback date of September 15th. So if the commission was not able to adopt a bipartisan 10-year set of legislative maps, they had an additional 2 weeks to try again to get to bipartisan consensus. Like Brian was mentioning, so much of our reforms was to give both parties a real seat at the table to try to encourage bipartisanship in our map drawing. So there are multiple attempts that are allowed for the commission and also the legislature and the congressional process to reach bipartisan consensus to get 10-year-long maps. Unfortunately, we obviously didn't get that. We only got Republican-supported 4-year maps. But in terms of the timing, of course, there was a months-long delay in when states got their census data. But we started advocating back in January and February of 2021 for the commission to be convened, which was something only Governor DeWine could do, and for them to start hosting preliminary public hearings to hear directly from Ohioans about how we are served or not under our current state legislative districts, to assess how the commission would actually function to pass rules about when it would host meetings, when it would send out notice about those meetings, how it would ensure that public hearings were actually accessible and safe for everyone. Of course, we can't talk about this in a vacuum. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, so ensuring that those meetings are actually accessible to as many Ohioans as possible also includes figuring out how to make sure that people aren't putting their safety at risk to engage in this process. Unfortunately, we didn't get that. Governor DeWine didn't actually convene the Redistricting Commission until August 6th. So as a reminder, that first deadline was September 1st. So there was less than a month before our first constitutional deadline. And it's only then that we got the Redistricting Commission even convened. Their first meeting lasted 7 minutes. All they did was swear in, and then they almost immediately adjourned with no mention about when we could expect public hearings, when we could expect maps from the Republican caucus, no sort of roadmap about how they were going to function. And they actually didn't host their first public hearing until August 23rd. So just 7 days before the first deadline. So when we're talking about how do you ultimately get to the end result of a fair map, that inherently starts with a fair process. And we didn't get that from the jump because the commission itself wasn't even convened in a due amount of time. So we blew past the September 1st deadline. The Republicans didn't offer their first map, and then the commission immediately adopted Senator Huffman's proposed set of maps until September 9th. So we're already 8 days late in the schedule. And then what happened to those hearings? So Brian was also talking about that so much of our reform was about ensuring that there was actual public engagement. There was robust public conversation about what our maps looked like to really give a very opposite reality of what happened in 2011, where our maps were drawn behind closed doors. There was almost no public input on the final maps. There were about 15 hearings that ultimately took place on the state legislative maps, but almost all of those, about 12 of them, happened before any official commission map had even been proposed. So those hearings happened around the state. So I will give credit where it's due that it was helpful that not all of those hearings happened in Columbus at the State House. It was nice that they happened in other cities. However, they all happened during the day. Almost all of them were during daytime working hours, and they were all in person. There was no opportunity to provide virtual testimony. And obviously, all of us here have figured out how to meet virtually, even though we're not sharing the same physical space. That should have been an option, particularly given that we are still in the midst of a pandemic. And then the Constitution also requires that a certain number of hearings take place after an official commission map had been proposed, but before it was voted on. And those 3 constitutionally mandated hearings were scheduled to start just 3 days before the final September 15th deadline. And that sends a very clear signal that you're not actually interested in engaging in a back and forth dialogue with the public about what maps you're proposing or how to fix them based on public comment. When you're starting public comment on the official map that you're going to vote on just 3 days before the deadline, that doesn't give you a lot of time to go back to the drawing board and fix what might be wrong in those maps. So that's what happened with our hearings. Ultimately, what happened with the maps? Well, they're quite gerrymandered. I would push back on that B grade that the Princeton gerrymandering or redistricting project gave to the Ohio Senate map, mainly because the Senate map would give 72% of the seats to Republicans. The House map would give 68% of our House seats to Republicans. So in total, about 70% of our state legislative seats would go to Republicans in a state that votes just 54% for their party. So they are just woefully partisan gerrymandered. The House is actually even more gerrymandered than our current House districts, which of course is a shame in face of the reforms that we passed to demand better. Also worth noting that the final maps, the maps that were ultimately adopted were actually introduced by Senator Huffman at 10:45 at night on September 15th, the final deadline, and not a single member of the public got to testify on those maps before they were adopted along party lines, actually just after midnight on September 16th. So all in all, the process and the maps are just an insult to our reform measures and to what Ohioans demanded. They essentially are a carbon copy of what happened in 2011 in our redistricting process that we actually flatly rejected by passing those reform measures. So what does gerrymandering still look like here in Ohio? Well, this is a visual representation of what it looks like. So as Brian was saying, in our state legislative reform, we not only expressly banned partisan gerrymandering, so there's a constitutional ban on any maps that unduly favor one party over the other. There is an additional requirement that's actually unique to Ohio. We're the only state that has it, that requires that our seat share closely correspond to our vote share to create what's called representational fairness. And that means that your votes actually equate to seats. So if we had representational fairness, if across the last decade, you are a party that is winning 54% of the vote, you should also only be occupying about 54% of the seats. Similarly, if you're a party that's winning 46% of the vote, you should also be occupying about 46% of the seats, because that would be a direct correlation between how people show up at the ballot box and who's able to actually get elected. As you can see, there's a vast difference between how we vote, which is shown on the pie chart on the left, and who actually will represent us under the new state legislative seats. So averaging together the Senate and House partisan breakdown, again, like I said, the Republicans will likely represent about 70% of our state legislative seats, which is just quite the disparity between how we vote. So just sort of bird's eye view of what's wrong with these maps. The maps are very good at cracking apart communities of interest into districts that don't make sense, pairing parts of counties and cities together with other parts that there aren't a lot of shared commonalities or interests or needs or concerns. Of course, they are partisan gerrymandered and don't actually represent how we vote as Ohioans. And they are also, unfortunately, very masterful at diluting the political power, especially of communities of color, by cracking them apart to drown out the strength of their vote, or packing them into as few districts as possible. And the combination of that cracking and packing is an ultimate dilution of their political power. These are all things that we were aiming to fix in those reform measures. So now I want to sort of dig into what the maps actually look like. So for example, just showing what, an example of how we're splitting apart like communities. So if you're thinking about the Mahoning Valley, Warren and Youngstown are two cities that are very similar. They are geographically close together. They share a lot of the same interests. The causes and concerns of the folks who live in Youngstown and Warren are very similar, and yet they are cracked apart into two different Senate districts, rather than combining them together to ensure that they as a unit actually have a strong voice at the ballot. So what you're seeing here are screenshots from the public redistricting tool called Dave's Redistricting. And the image on the left is just the image of the districts themselves. The different colors only denote the different districts themselves. On the right-hand side, you're shown a partisan heat map based on precincts. So the darker the color, the more concentrated voters, either who are Republican or Democratic, are. So of course, we can't look at these separations in a vacuum, right? When you're looking at the partisan makeup of places like Warren and Youngstown, it of course is not a mistake that those are two Democratic strongholds in the Mahoning Valley that have now been cracked apart into two different districts. So we also have to think about, why are you drawing the lines where you're drawing them? Of course, the lines have to be drawn somewhere. We aren't able to keep every single community or community of interest whole. However, we should be drawing districts with the ultimate interest of ensuring that communities as a whole have a real pathway to political power. And when we're separating unnecessarily areas like Warren and Youngstown, which absolutely could have been combined into one Senate district, and one that would actually be representative of who lives there, we didn't. And why didn't we? So that's an example there of cracking apart communities of interest. Another example is Canton and Massillon, right? Canton and Massillon are very similar. They're very close together. We split them apart at the House level. These are areas that are actually currently in the same House district and now no longer will be. Why are we separating these communities? Does it make sense? Did the people in Canton and Massillon come in and testify and say, yeah, we're so different, it makes sense for us to be carved apart? Of course they didn't, right? So again, looking here to, of course, it is notable that Massillon has a sizable Democratic community, so too does Canton. So the original district combined these two areas and instead were including Canton, with a lot more of the Republican areas around North Canton. So a district that used to be reliably Democratic is now only barely Democratic. So those lines are drawn in obviously a very intentional way. Also, like I mentioned, we do a very masterful job, not we, I didn't draw the maps, but the map drawers did a very masterful job at cracking and packing, especially communities of color across the state. So here, looking at Cuyahoga County, what does it look like carving apart parts of the Black community in and around Cleveland and its suburbs? I want to pay particular attention to the district here that goes all the way from the Strongsville area out to Cuyahoga County, and then all the way down the entire length of Summit County to the Stark County border, right? So, oops, let me go back. This district, essentially, so these are the new Senate districts for Cuyahoga County. And what they essentially did was they carved apart that U-shaped district that used to be Dolan's district, right? That was the outer suburbs around here in the county, and anchored a lot more of the districts, at least inside Cuyahoga County. But they still managed to crack apart these areas. So this map over here on the left is an overlay of Black populations in and around Cleveland. So the darker the color, again, the more dense the Black population is. So, you know, why are we carving apart these specific neighborhoods, particularly looking at areas like Solon, which perhaps would make more sense to be anchored into districts within Cuyahoga County, are instead dragged out into counties like Cuyahoga and Portage, in districts that just don't make sense. We also see that Dayton is perhaps one of the best examples of unnecessarily cracking apart the Black suburbs like Trotwood and Huber Heights around the Dayton area. So here you're just seeing two similar maps. That Trotwood is not in a Dayton anchored district and instead dragged out into overwhelmingly white rural conservative districts does not make any sense unless what your objective is to undermine their ability to elect representatives of their choosing. So a really unfortunate example there. Same thing happens in Hamilton and Franklin County. Hamilton, of course, cracking apart sort of the northern Black suburbs outside of Dayton. In Franklin County, you know, peeling apart Black suburbs, of course. This Senate district, I've got to point this out because it's so wild. This is the new district for Senator Tina Mahara. It goes all the way from, this is the Delaware border up here in Franklin County. So it goes all the way from Westerville, a northern suburb of Columbus. It goes all the way down the side here. This is all connected into one district. Here's the southern border of Franklin County. It goes around the city of Columbus, oops, and then over here to pick up other parts of just outside downtown Columbus. So over here, this is called the Hilltop. It's a relatively low income mixed race community, but it's also paired with New Albany, which is perhaps one of the richest suburbs in Ohio, two communities that just could not be more dissimilar in their interests or causes and concerns, and yet we are pulling them together into similar districts, into the same district, and why are we doing that, right? So unfortunately, lots of examples there of cracking apart communities. So that's what happened in the state ledge process. That ended in the middle of September. And then just 2 weeks after that final September deadline for the state ledge process, we had the first deadline for the congressional process. Now, the congressional process was all dictated by that 2018 reform. There are two main bodies who are in charge of the congressional process. It's mostly the legislature, but the commission also played a role in step 2 of the process. So the first deadline was for the state legislature by September 30th to have passed a bipartisan 10-year congressional map. They blew past that. They didn't even propose a map by then. It then kicked back to the commission, and the commission had the reins again for an entire month of October to try to get a bipartisan congressional map passed. They did absolutely nothing. They held literally one hearing about 5 days short of their final deadline, where they took testimony only from folks who actually had submitted maps. So at most, they would have been able to hear from about 40 Ohioans. Actually, only 5 people testified. And then that gave the power right back to the legislature to rush through the final steps of their process. So just really quickly there, again, we're starting late and we're also rushed at the end. So we missed 2 deadlines where we had no proposals, we had no real public hearing opportunities. And then all of a sudden the legislature woke up and said, oh, shoot, we got to pass a congressional map. So they scheduled 5 legislative hearings all in 1 week, some of them overlapping in time and day in 2 different chambers of the legislature, so really curbing public engagement there. There were little notice of those hearings. For the Senate side, the committee was being incredibly strict about requiring testimony to be submitted 24 hours in advance of the hearing. And when the Republicans finally proposed their maps, we actually had to submit our testimony before we ever saw the maps, which just makes it difficult to actually give testimony on what those maps look like. And ultimately, the maps themselves were also gerrymandered. So on the low side, they'd give about 80% of our congressional seats to Republicans. On the high side, they'd give 87% of our congressional seats to Republicans. So again, what does gerrymandering still look like in Ohio? This is what it looks like. We've gotten even more gerrymandered map now than we do for the last decade. Between 12 and 13 seats going to the Republican caucus, even though they don't win anywhere near that level of our vote. So just really quickly, what's wrong with the map? Here's what our map looks like. So on the left is just different colors to denote the different districts. On the right is the partisan heat map for what those districts, how those districts will likely lean in terms of partisanship. The important ones, of course, for folks in and around Cuyahoga County, the 11th district is protected. It's now fully within Cuyahoga County rather than stretching down into Akron. So it's just a much more centralized district. At the very last minute, the Republicans offered, I don't know, an Akron district, sort of, I put that in quotes because it's not really an Akron anchored district, of course, that just barely leans Democratic by under a percentage point. The other sort of major difference here is Congresswoman Capter's district. It's no longer technically, I guess, a snake on the lake. We just sort of shifted it west by adding these 4 very rural northwestern counties. And that district is now just barely a Republican district. So an interest there in unseating the longest serving woman in Congress. So that's what we did in terms of partisanship for our map. Also just want to note, fun fact, this 5th congressional district that goes all the way from Lorain County on Lake Erie to Grand Lake St. Mary on the Indiana border, I'm going to call it the snake between the lakes, is actually longer than the original snake on the lake between Toledo and Cleveland. So just pairing together parts of the state that just frankly don't make sense to combine together. So what's wrong with our new maps? So digging into what we did with our major cities, Columbus, this purple district is Congresswoman Beatty's new district. It does a decent job of trying to contain as much of the city of Columbus and the urban core as possible. The thing I've got to note is that this little yellow portion that's carved out of her district is actually where the Ohio State House is. So we carved out the Ohio State House from the Columbus anchored district. I'm actually going to go back one slide. So this is that little piece here. And that means that the Ohio State House, which is in central downtown Columbus, is now in a district that goes all the way to Wilmington in rural Clinton County. Those are 2 parts of the state that are just not similar. Of course, they should not be in the same congressional district. What did we do to Hamilton County and Cincinnati? We split it into 3 different congressional districts, all of which lean Republican, despite the fact that Hamilton County is actually a Democratic county. So while they followed the congressional requirement, congressional rule requirement to keep the city of Cincinnati whole, they kept the city whole and then moved it into all this county here, the 1st congressional district for Congressman Shabbat. They just took the entire city and then sank it into a Republican district. So we, in our activism, said it's not enough to just follow the bare minimum requirement that you keep Cincinnati whole. You have to keep Cincinnati whole in a Hamilton anchored district that is actually representative of the folks who live there. And that's just not what we saw. Otherwise chipping apart parts of the county and driving them into otherwise very rural districts. You see that again, just sort of zooming in. This is the Akron seat that goes, it includes all of Medina County. So that sort of is what weights it away from being a more solidly Democratic district. So for example, had you paired, I don't know, Akron and Canton together, which maybe would have made more sense from a community of interest standpoint, we instead are pairing all the way up to the lake down into Medina County and over to Akron into a district that's a 49% Dem, 48% Republican seat. So when we're thinking about the political reality, Democrats don't have a good track record of winning 49% districts. So that's going to be a tough one for sure. And then just outlining these snake between the lake districts here between the lakes. Also at the congressional level, we are cracking and packing Black communities across the state. You can see that in Franklin County and Hamilton County. When you are unnecessarily carving that county up, So Hamilton County itself could actually be included almost in its entirety into just one congressional district. That we are splitting it up into 3, of course, is just unnecessary, but that we are also unnecessarily cracking apart Black communities is such a negative impact of these maps. You can see that too. I know that my time is totally run over, so I'm going to go very quick just to talk about what's next in our fight. That was all phase 1 of the redistricting process. Now we're in court. So All on the Line is a part of the National Redistricting Action Fund, which is supporting 2 different lawsuits, one at the state legislative level, one at the congressional level. There are 3 lawsuits challenging the state legislative maps, 2 challenging the congressional districts. The Supreme Court, like Brian said, heard oral arguments on Wednesday in the state legislative cases. I would say I'm cautiously optimistic about our chances to be successful in getting a favorable opinion, but I hesitate ever to put any good omens on a Supreme Court, just learning from experience. But I think that what was clear is that there were a number of justices who expressed skepticism in the Republicans' argument that the provision in the Constitution requiring that maps not be partisan gerrymandered and reflect how we actually vote were merely aspirational, because that's why else would they be there? In fact, that's actually a line that the Chief Justice said herself. The Republicans are going to argue that this was just merely aspirational, and then she tossed out an aside that said, and if that's the case, I'm not even sure why it's in there to begin with. So I will also say that the other sort of main thing that I thought was telling in that oral argument is that the Chief Justice went into a very long line of questioning to the Republicans' attorney about what a potential redraw process would look like. And I think that oftentimes when justices or judges are talking about what a potential remedy would look like, that they are at least thinking about the potential of ruling in your way, and that remedy conversation is necessary. So I remain hopeful. Of course, that doesn't mean that we'll back down and how hard we have to fight. But anyways, thank you for obliging me and letting me go over time. I know that I took more time.
You're okay.
But anyways, that was the process itself. Of course, the entirety of it was such a disappointment. But I will say that despite how disappointing the official process was, it's very clear that Ohioans are fired up and dedicated to continuing their fight that we waged in 2015 and in 2018. We trained thousands of Ohioans in this process. We got hundreds of them to provide testimony. We are just one organization in this fight. So that was replicated across so many of our partner organizations who are also engaged here. So we are not yet done. And I will also just close by saying that Jay is right to say that this is the perfect starting conversation for a series of conversations about the rule of law, because I say often that when we say it's all on the line, it's not hyperbolic. We are fighting for the fate of our democracy in our fight for fair maps, and any other issue that you care about is inherently impacted, usually negatively, by our gerrymandered maps. So whether we are able to safeguard our democracy by passing pro-voter policies, whether we are able to protect access to abortion and reproductive health care, whether we are able to implement criminal justice policies that reform our justice system to actually live up to its promises, that all inherently depends on whether we can actually elect people who represent our values in those issues into representative delegations at both the state and federal level. So if you care about any of those issues, you should also inherently care about redistricting. So I'm just very grateful for the CMPA for even hosting this conversation. Thanks.
Carrie, do we have questions?
We do. And I think this is something, Katie, that we talked about in our planning session about what's going to happen next. So the court has heard oral arguments this week. We talked that it's going to have to be a pretty quick turnaround if anything would even happen before a primary. And then a specific question we got from the audience is, what if the court does order the commission to produce a new map and the commission refuses to do so? So Professor Glassman, I don't know if you have thoughts on that as well, and you want to start with that question.
Thank you, Kari. Yes, I would be happy to take a crack at that. Of course, we are looking at extremely compressed timeframes here, or an extremely compressed time frame. Don't be surprised if the Ohio Supreme Court issues a decision in the state maps cases before the end of this month. Under Senate Bill 258, the filing deadline for candidates, which was February 2nd, has already been moved to March 4th. That creates a more manageable schedule for all of this while staying true to the primary date in early May. But I wanted to address one other part of that question, Kari, which is something I've been worrying about as well. The Supreme Court is not empowered to draw replacement maps. Rather, it has the authority to order the Redistricting Commission to adopt a new plan under 11.09, or with respect to the Congressional Map, to order the General Assembly or the Redistricting Commission to remedy any legal defects under Article 19, Section 3B. So, excellent question. What if those bodies fail to do their job? The best answer that I've been able to come up with is that it is incumbent on the Ohio Supreme Court to provide to craft a very specific and precise order that will not allow wiggle room, so that we're not having lots of back and forth where the new map comes back before the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court has to say, no, that doesn't work either. So look for the Supreme Court, if there is a favorable ruling, to see how, again, how precise and specific that order is to direct either the Ohio Redistricting Commission or the General Assembly to do its work on redrafting.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right. So one quick note is that the Senate Bill 258, which is the congressional map, only shifted the filing deadline for congressional candidates. So the existing state legislative filing deadline is even more pressing of a timeline because that still is February 2nd. So we're under 2 months away from that. Actually was that was a point that was raised by Justice Brunner during the oral arguments on Wednesdays, to actually, well, she asked the Republican attorney if she asked if the Supreme Court actually had the authority to shift the primary date and filing deadline, and he said no, we think that that is a sole power of the legislature. Which is fascinating for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the Supreme Court has actually moved filing deadlines and primaries multiple times before. So I was hoping that one of the justices would have said, sorry, suggesting that we were, deciding something outside of our purview then, but they didn't. But so I do think that even mentioning that means that they too are cognizant of the impending deadlines. I think that that also has been implicitly communicated in all of their schedule orders that they've issued in both the state legislative and congressional cases for when filings are due. They have issued scheduling orders that were more expedited than any of the realtors were asking for for the suits challenging the maps themselves. So I think they also are aware of that. And then of course, there was a lot of back and forth even between the Chief Justice and the main Republican attorney about, that idea, Brian, that you were mentioning about how this could just go on ad nauseum, that you could just keep going back and forth. And actually at one point, she sort of created what I thought was a bit of a plank for him to walk off. And then I think he walked off of it, but she was saying, well, okay, say we disagree with you and we overturn the map, then what? he goes, oh, well, that will depend on what the Supreme Court orders. And so she goes, okay, well, so then do you think it's necessary for us to issue, a list of instructions for the commission for how to go through the process? And if it were appropriate, I would have shouted from the audience, yes, please, very explicit instructions about what the redraw process should look like. Because to a question in the chat box, no, there were not any consequences for them having missed their deadlines. And yes, you're right to name that all of us lawyers know, many of us know that when deadlines are outlined in law, let alone the Constitution, that they actually do mean something, that the word shall is, very forceful in legal language. At least that's what I'm remembering from my con law class. And yet that didn't matter. And I actually brought this up to a member of our litigation team because, these are the thoughts that keep me up at night. Because Ohio, the Supreme Court and the legislature is not foreign to, even when the Supreme Court rules in one way to direct the legislature to do something, that doesn't always mean that they do it. A perfect example of that is fixing our unconstitutional school funding formula, which has been ruled unconstitutional 4 times, almost as long as I've been alive, right? And yet it hasn't actually ever gotten fixed. And it's because there was, to my opinion, with all due respect to the Supreme Court, both weak enforcement of their opinions, demanding that the legislature act, but then of course also a complete lack of, respect, I guess, for what opinions actually mean from the Supreme Court to actually go through with that. So I too am worried about, I think sort of the middle case scenario for us is if the court overturns the map, but doesn't offer strong enough instructions to the commission in what a redraw process should look like, particularly because the Constitution is incredibly vague about what a redraw process looks like for the state legislative maps. There's no calendar, there's no real, it's not clear, for example, whether are you just redrawing the 4-year map, or is there also the opportunity to actually adopt a 10-year map if you manage to get bipartisan consensus? So lots of unanswered questions that hopefully the court will provide answers to. And then I will also just flag that even if we get a strong opinion from the court that not only overturns the map, but also offers strict instructions about how to redraw it, the Republican attorney made what I thought was an astonishing sort of threat, which was, in this back and forth with the chief when she was saying, okay, well, so say we give you those instructions and then what? And he said, well, the commission could attempt to follow whatever rules you have about how to redraw the map, or they'll throw up their hands and say that they were forced to violate federal law, and we'll go into federal court and challenge the redrawn maps. And Justice Brenner said, well, how are you going to do that? The Rucho opinion obviously closed federal courthouse doors to partisan gerrymandering claims. And he goes, oh, no, it wouldn't be a partisan gerrymandering challenge. It would be an equal protection challenge, because what the court would be suggesting is that to solve gerrymandering, you are forcing us to gerrymander against Republican and urban counties by forcing us to have proportional representation. Of course, those weren't the words that he said, but that's what he's arguing, right? So I also would not be shocked even if we go through a redraw process, there aren't, this back and forth, not only in state court, but potentially also in federal court.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to jump in and address Joe's question, which just came in a moment ago. So if the commission does not produce a compliant map, or elections delayed until such time as they do so, my answer is, don't know. I would direct your attention to what's happening in North Carolina, where the state Supreme Court just delayed the primary by 2 months. They normally have their primary in March, I believe, and it's been delayed to May so that that court can properly consider the legal challenges to gerrymandering that have been made. So I don't know if you have a different take on that, Katy, but.
No, I think that's right. To my mind, and this is a very personal opinion, I don't see how we don't have movement of, at the very least, our filing deadlines, if not also our primary, just because if you're looking at the calendar, so even if we get an opinion by the end of this year, which would be so fast, even if we get an opinion by the end of this year, The filing deadline is on September 2nd, and it's not just about what the redraw process looks like. It's also about the back end election administration piece that comes after you draw your maps. The 88 boards of elections will then have to update all of their voter rolls to account for where the new district lines are. Then also, of course, candidates will need time to go out and collect signatures for their petitions to get on the ballot. So there's a lot of other, back end stuff that has to be done to prepare for elections that we don't often think about when we're thinking about the calendar to prepare even after the maps are drawn. And that's just with the state legislative side. Of course, then there's also the congressional calendar. So when the Constitution is actually slightly more instructive there, if the congressional map is overturned, the legislature gets 30 days to try to redraw a map. And if they cannot do that, the commission also gets 30 days to try to redraw the map. So that means you have a 60-day period after the opinion to go through that redraw process, and then of course go through all the election administration and candidate access issues that are necessary before an election. So I don't see how we get around moving back those dates and the primary itself, but of course we won't know until the court comes out with their opinions.
Kari, can I just 30 seconds on what's happening nationally?
Yes, please.
Great. So I alluded to this in my roadmap slide. In the United States House of Representatives, Democrats currently hold 221 seats, Republicans 213, 1 seat vacant. So razor thin majority for Democrats. And the results of these gerrymandering actions and then lawsuits could very well determine which party controls the United States House of Representatives. I've mentioned North Carolina. Keep your eye on Texas. The Justice Department just sued Texas. Georgia has created a very gerrymandered map. And on the Democratic side, I will say, yes, Illinois has created a gerrymandered map that favors Democrats. It got extremely low scores from the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. So all of this is in play as we approach the primary and then the general elections for 2022.
So our time is almost up. So please excuse me for making these comments. First, thank you guys for being here. You're spectacular. And please excuse me for preaching to the choir of you and the 50 or 60 of us are here. But let's assume for a moment that we have given up our national ethical basis of do the right thing, or integrity, honesty, decency, and courage. And we have simply adopted a national ethical basis of do whatever you can get away with on every possible level. And let's assume that that philosophy is what brought you, Katie, to listening to the lawyers say, well, the deadlines don't mean much to us and we'll just file in federal court and we will stretch this out. And let's assume that our voting totals are low. And let's assume there's only 40 or 50 or 60 of us here. It doesn't change the prospect that it's actually the commitment of people to begin talking about this and dealing with it on every level. You know, we have a media basis, which is now gutted. We really don't have news anymore. We don't have actual news. We don't have ethical guidelines on news. We also have false equivalency, where people are all considered equal. It's just another point of view. And we have the public that's tired of any bickering whatsoever, thinks everybody's jerks, so they're not going to be involved. And what we, the 50 that are here, need to do is go talk to another 50 and say, start having the conversations. Again, please excuse me for this, but Katie and both of the people alluded to this in the beginning. These are the biggest of all issues. This is American democracy. There can't be a Christmas gathering without people talking to people they know about. Let's wake up and do something. I'm sorry, guys, but this is such an important thing. It is so necessary for just the us of us to start talking about this. Because Katie's right, the Supreme Court's been messing around with school funding for as long as I've been around, not as long as she's been around. And they're ignored, but they can't ignore us in the end. So take the shot. Come join us this coming 6 months as we look at all these issues and how the rule of law used as a bludgeon and used as a shield is affecting all of us. and then start talking to everybody else. Sorry, guys, I cut you both off.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you,
Oh,
Jay.
thank you. You're wonderful. Thanks for coming and helping us. We'll call you back for sure.
Please do.
All right, cool.
Thank
Carrie,
you.
Thank
what
you,
else?
everyone.
Are we done?
We're done. Have a fantastic weekend.
And
Everyone
a
take care.
fantastic holiday season, everybody.
Yes.
And
Right.
a happy,
Everyone.
peaceful new year, but peaceful only to the extent as go out and talk about it.
That's right.
Thanks, Jay.
All right,
Thanks,
guys.
Katie.
Thanks so
Professor
much.
Glassman.
Everybody have a good
Take
day.
care.
Be
Bye,
well,
everyone.
everybody.